All right, so today I am joined by James from the Tennis Pilot tipping service. Welcome to the podcast, James. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I'm not too bad. How are you today?
Yep, I'm okay. Thank you very much. And likewise, thank you for coming on the podcast. Let's start off with some introductions, if you don't mind, though. Can you give me a little bit, tell the listeners a little bit about you, who you are, and what you currently do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm James. I've been running Tennis Pilot since 2016. I started it with a friend from university, Nick. And so I'm also working as a product data manager at the minute as well, outside of Tennis Pilot. So it's kind of mixed between the two. But with Tennis Pilot, it's largely a sort of mixture of data analytics with the tennis work and then a lot of fundamentals, a lot of analysis of the actual matches.
Okay, and you run this with, is it Nicholas, your business partner?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Okay, and you do this both of you as a side gig alongside your full-time jobs?
Yes.
Okay.
So it was kind of funny the way it started because at university I did English, so quite far from sports. And Nick did philosophy and theology, so very, very different kind of subjects. But when we met at uni, he sort of said, "Oh, you played a lot of tennis when you were younger. Have you ever bet on tennis?" And kind of like from there, I was like, "No, I haven't. I watch it a lot, blah, blah, blah." Sat down to watch a few games together. And it was quite funny how we just sort of realized, oh, this is actually both really fun and something that we were able to do quite well. And it kind of just grew from there. And I think our roles have changed a bit over time as it develops. We started in 2016, so it's been a while now. But yes, we've essentially been doing this together since the beginning.
Okay, so the best part of 7 years running the service and no doubt betting yourselves alongside holding down a full-time job. That's how many hours a week are you running Tennis Pilot, and how much time do you put into it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it really depends on what's happening at the time. Because I think for me, the part of the reason why it worked so well is that it's really watching the tennis, staying up to date with the tennis is really something that I do anyway. It's something I enjoy. It's not work in the same way. I think the work part of it obviously is that it's not always obvious or it's not always easy to find the things that I value. It's not always easy for you to kind of actually make the profit from that fun enjoyment of watching it. But yeah, I think probably in terms of hours, it's a few hours a day. It's like 2-3 hours a day, depending on the day. Like you might have weekends or weeks sometimes where you spend a lot longer on it than that. But yeah, probably a few hours a day on average.
I believe did you meet at university?
Yes.
The pair of you, and you were friends from there. Was your studies part of the work that you've done, or did it align with the work that you do at Tennis Pilot now?
It's kind of a yes and no, I guess. I did an English degree, so it's got nothing to do with sports, betting, or tennis. I guess in one sense, it was just about reasoning and thinking logically and stuff like that. So that always helped. But I then did a master's in data science. And so that master's very much does, help. And I think part of what made me do that was that I realized I've been using data science techniques and I've been doing data science with tennis without really calling it that or thinking of it like that. But yeah, so in that sense, the second degree was much more relevant than the first degree was to the actual tennis itself.
Okay, so a passion for tennis, enjoyment of the sport, alongside the data science certainly all led towards that. Let's also quickly talk about the betting side of it. I guess you bet on your own selections, and how does betting fit into your own personal betting or the betting you do with your partner? How does that fit in with what you do?
Yeah, so I bet for a long time. Again, started with the tennis and then realized, for example, with Edwards Tips, who you've also had on.
Yep.
He was a follower of Tennis Pilot and got to know him really well. And Craig is a phenomenal tipster in golf, for example. So I've been following his tips in the golf, follow some horse tipsters, a bit of this, bit of that. It sort of depends how much time I have and how much I want to invest in it at that given moment. But yes, personally, I certainly bet on my own selections. I'll sometimes bet in play if the mood catches me. Again, it's sort of more of a side. It's like a bank builder, if you like, as opposed to, I don't bet professionally. I wouldn't consider myself a professional bettor. I sort of tried doing that a little bit at one point, and I prefer having it as something that you do on the side. I think it's nice to take a hobby and make some money out of it. I don't mind doing that. Obviously, that's what I've been doing. But I think when you take a hobby and you turn it into a job, in that sense, where everything relies on that, that took the fun out of it a little bit from my side.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting because I get guests on who, have taken that professional route. And certainly, my hat goes off to them to deal with the challenges, like you say, of actually trying to eke a living from your betting on the sport. But you obviously do invest some money and you do bet yourself. So there is that part of it. And but it sounds like you have a pretty busy day job as well alongside. So no doubt something has to give on that front. Okay, so let's talk about actual betting on tennis itself, because we liaised a little bit on email and some of the topics for today's podcast, and you sent me quite a lot back on, your analysis of the tennis market. So let's start things off. You talked about the big picture of finding value and the methods that you use. Do you want to expand on that a little bit, like things like expected value and statistical analysis?
Yeah, so I think the reason why I mentioned that is I think it can be easy when you're betting a lot to forget the actual basis behind all of it. Because I think really when you're betting on tennis or betting on any sport, you need to have a way of understanding why you're picking certain bets and not others, beyond just saying, well, I like that bet or I like that price. And I think for me, that comes back to really deeply understanding where is it that value comes from? What is value in the first place? So if you take a match where the prices are out of line, where you think one of the prices is way too long or short, then over time, you're going to make a lot of money betting on that line. If it's, for example, 2.5 and it should be evens, you're going to make a lot of money betting on. But it's actually a bit numerous when you think about how do you know if a bet is going to be valuable? How do you even judge that kind of concept when it comes to tennis? And I think for me, there's two big things that you have to think about when you're engaging with that kind of question. And the first one is when you're betting on tennis, how are the prices set generally? Or like, what does a price in a tennis match generally represent? And what does it sort of tell you about that match? And then the second thing would be, what are the different ways that you can evaluate that price? Because I think one of the obvious ways is statistical. You can say, well, if you take historic matches where the price is similar, or you take historic matches where the surface is similar or something like that. And that's really useful. But generally speaking, that way of reasoning, which basically says, well, this is a trend from the past, is that going to continue? To judge whether or not it's going to continue, you need to have an understanding of what's actually happening in the matches, because trends appear in random data all the time. So I think the reason why I come back to that question of like, what is an edge? What is expected value? Is really because of that focus. You need to understand both the ability to see the statistics and what they're telling you, but then also to dig into them, look at the actual matches and what's happening and say, well, 1 minute, maybe the bookies are pricing this up this way because of this kind of bias. I mean, the classic example would just be a recency bias or kind of a hype bias, whatever you want to call it. And that's something you can only understand. The evidence might be there in the data, but you can only really understand that if you can look at that data and say, this is what might be causing it. So yeah, I think at a high level, for me, the biggest point about that is just to be aware every time you're looking at a tennis match, there is no kind of single source of truth or anything like that. It's a combination of these strange different factors that you have to be able to weigh in order to even make a judgment about whether something could be valuable or not.
Okay, so when you come and look at a market, do you price it up yourself before looking at perhaps what the market is telling you? So then you're not, inherently biased by, look at the odds checker price for this, it's saying 6-4.
Yeah.
I make him about a 6-4 chance. You might price it up yourself and make him a 2-1 shot, for example. Is that your approach?
So I think, again, this depends. Depending on the market and depending on the match, I will have a more or less of a strong read before I've even seen the market. So I think some players in some markets are inherently more predictable or more precise. And I think an obvious example of this would be something like a set overs market. There's a lot of data and there's a lot of very clear reasons why these kind of markets need to be priced within quite a narrow range for most players. Whereas I think if you think about the personalities of different players, you might have two players who have very similar underlying data, but you price them up completely differently because you know what they're like temperamentally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to me, I'm more inclined to try and understand why the price is the way it is, and then make a judgment about whether or not I think the sort of cause of that price is reasonable. I'm not generally going to be as inclined to price things up beforehand in a kind of rigorous way. Like, I will have a sense of the price that I think it should be. And that's very, like, at this point, I've looked at so many matches, I'll always have that sense. But I think ultimately it's very hard. The bookies will price things on average very accurately. So I think if I was trying to price up every single match and then go back and look at the prices, it would take me a long, long time. And it wouldn't necessarily align with how I've found value in the past, which, as I say, is more from understanding why that price might be the way it is.
Okay, and then how do you start to filter it down? Obviously, there's hundreds of tennis matches that go on every day and every week. How do you then start to filter it through? You have a very good record on the ATP tour. You're focusing on some of the higher quality events. Is that your approach to look at some of the big tournaments, or is it certain players or certain courses? Tell me a little bit about that, how you approach that and start to break it down.
Yeah, so generally speaking, it's going to be a case of I'll have players that I'm watching. That's the first thing. You'll have players that you're very aware of as being showing some kind of pattern or consistency in a way that makes me think that they're going to be valuable, at least in certain contexts. The second thing is because I know the player so well at this point, like I can look down 100 matches very quickly, and I will normally know just by glancing at the matchups if I have a reasonable read on that match. And this is kind of what I mean when I say, like, if I try to price everything up, in a way, I'm kind of removing my edge, which is the fact that I don't have to price everything up. The bookies have to do that. I can just pick the ones that really talk to me. And that, again, it really depends. Like this, it really depends on the matchups. Sometimes I might look at a match and I might think to myself, almost regardless of what price this player is, I want them on side. So unless the price looks really bad, I'm going to be inclined to take those bets because I know historically that I can get quite greedy in those contexts. And actually, when I have that read and it's that strong, I'm normally good to go as long as I get, above a minimum kind of price. Like you have to set some rules like that. Yeah, I think normally from my perspective, it's going to be a case of adjusting to what I see. I'll have a quick look at the matches, even if it's say 100, quickly skim through them. And then I'll normally have a handful, maybe 10 or 15 of those that appeal to me. And then I'll be really digging into the stats for those matches. And again, this would be based on lots of different things.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those things that you're looking at, key factors for understanding the game of tennis. You listed 10 different variables there, from form, styles, matchups, the surface. Tell me about some of those and which you perhaps feel are most important.
Yeah, so the first thing for me usually is I need to understand what I think is going to happen in this match. Because I think there are certain statistical things you can do to filter out matches, and there are certain filters that I found work very well. But fundamentally, if I don't feel comfortable predicting what's going to happen in the match, then I won't bet on it. I'm not just going to go with something, as I say, because it's a good trend or anything like that. I need to have a sense of why I'm finding this to be a valuable match. So probably the biggest things for this would be I will have watched these players recently. And one of the key things that I'll be judging is how do they respond to different playing styles? How do they respond to different surfaces, different court speeds, these kind of things? And normally when I'm looking at a match, I will be quite literally visualizing how this match is going to play. And I will notice things about what I'm imagining. So I might notice, oh, 1 minute, okay, so you've got a player here. I know this player because they've been playing recently. They've improved their backhand in a certain particular way. Maybe like they've improved a shot that allows them to absorb pace and redirect it more effectively. That kind of thing, if I'm imagining the match, I might realize, well, 1 minute, the other player is someone who likes to attack that wing. And so actually, this is the kind of context where the price might not be taking into account what is quite a subtle thing, but actually it's quite a big deal. If that player's favorite shot is to really drill into the backhand with, say, an inside-out forehand, then being able to redirect that pace effectively is a big difference. It makes a big difference. And that's just one sort of kind of niche example of the type of thing that will come to mind when I'm looking at the match. And normally when I'm doing kind of the fundamental analysis for a match, it's going to be less a list of tick boxes, and it's going to be more a case of looking at the match and all the factors that I highlighted there. They might come into play, they might not. So a classic one is matchups. Some matchups are really, for whatever reason, they're just really obviously important. It's very clear that that particular matchup is going to really change the way both players play and interact. Whereas in other contexts, you look at the matchup and you sort of say, well, I actually can't imagine exactly how these two players are going to interact with each other. But yeah, it's always going to come down to the different variables, so like form, things like surface, the court speed, the weather. These things are all going to be playing into my mind. But really the way that is actualized, the way that I actually deal with it, is by sort of imagining how that's going to impact the match. How is that actually going to change how these two players play? And then obviously alongside that, you might have some statistical filters with it, but we can come on to that in a minute.
So it's that deep understanding of the players and the characteristics that really help inform you. Do you find bookmakers price it up based on more recent form rather than that understanding of the characteristics of each player? Is that how they approach it? An algorithm approach to, this guy's ranked 20th in the world versus this person who's 50th in the world, and we'll price them up accordingly?
Yeah, so I think my rough heuristic with bookmakers and the market in general is that for most matches, the pricing will be, the way I would think of it is it's not sensitive enough. Most prices are too generic. They're too based on the overall data, and they don't have enough nuance to them. This is not always the case, and sometimes the prices can be really confusing. And I think the markets have actually got a lot better at dealing with this over the past couple of years. It's one of the biggest things I've noticed is that prices, usually in the past, you would notice the changes in approaches to players. You would notice that over 5-10 matches, the market has changed its mind, quote unquote, about a player. But now I have started to notice that literally within a tournament, even if a player seems to be, say, in quote unquote good form, the markets do seem to generally be a bit better than they used to be, adjusting to the specifics of matchups, the specifics of different times of day, even things like that, very sort of subtle things. But in general, yes, I would agree. I think the biggest edge, or kind of really all of the edge from my side, comes from understanding why that generic price, even though it's going to be very accurate over 10,000 or 100,000 matches, is not actually accurate enough in this instant. It largely comes down to that.
Okay, no, fascinating. And you mentioned that statistics and the stats that are important and how you judge them in context. We've got things like the raw stats, for example, you talked about win rate, but there are obviously more granular stats that no doubt you look at. Talk me through some of those and how you use them to inform your bets.
Yeah, so I think statistics to me fall largely into two categories, like as in the use of statistics. I think you either have statistics that can allow you to scope the markets. So that's, to me, one of the things that I'll do a few times a month. I mean, it depends on the time of the year. But certainly as we come into like the clay season now, one of the things I'll be doing is I'll be trying to use big picture statistical filters. So simple things like looking at players who've been particularly high performing so far this year, who've been particularly profitable so far this year, maybe players who've deviated from expectations, particularly a lot this year, players who've underperformed. Again, there's lots of different ways of slicing that question, but essentially what I'm looking for is there evidence in the data that this player is someone who could be interesting for the next period of the year? So that's one way that I'll use the statistics, is to just help me quickly identify those players. Normally, I'll have a sense of them anyway from having watched the tennis, and then that will just confirm or like maybe confuse my suspicions. But then the second way, probably the more day-to-day way of doing it, would be to use the filters as a kind of way of correcting myself or a way of checking myself. Because I think one of the things that I've noticed very consistently over the years is there are certain ways that I can explain matches or think about or feel about matches where I know that I will consistently feel a certain way, even if, and essentially, if this data agrees with me, that's good. And if it doesn't agree with me, that's bad. And those kind of situations where I might use, even again, just a very simple filter, like one that I used for quite a while, has again been less effective recently, is simply looking at how well this player does against players of a similar rank. And again, these kind of very simple filters keep you in check. So it's very easy to watch a player who's done very well at a lower level, for example, and to be very impressed with them. And sometimes you just need a few statistics there to remind you that maybe the reason that they are still a good price is because they haven't really proven themselves against better players. And again, that's not going to necessarily change my decision, but it's just information that I can then take into account. So I'm, again, when I'm imagining the match or thinking about the match, I sort of think to myself, okay, are they really going to look like that? Am I overstating how well they're going to be able to hit that shot or whatever? But yeah, so that's the second way, and probably the more common way that I'll use the statistics, is just as a way of filtering for bad intuitions, bad instincts, bad reasons from my side.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how does it work in terms of, with Nicholas, do you independently try and identify value and then talk about whether you both agree? Or do you pick out bets and he picks out bets and you combine them together? How does that dynamic work?
It's a bit of both. It's both of what you just said, actually. So you might have, on the one hand, we'll go away and do our own analysis, and then we'll generally have a phone call where we'll discuss what we think about the day's matches. And it will depend, because obviously sometimes we won't have any common themes at all. Sometimes we'll have been interested in completely different matches, and in some ways that's easier. But usually we'll have a similar sense of what's going on. And so we will discuss, if we disagree about matches, we'll discuss why, try and understand the perspectives. Again, when we've been doing this for so long, it can be quite predictable, because I think we've been doing this a long time now. So I think we understand to some extent how we both tick and what we are interested in and how we think about it and yada, yada, yada. And again, that's not to say that it's not worth discussing still. It very much is. And, you can still learn a lot about what you think just by discussing what both of you think. But I think at this point, it's more a case of having our own sense of what we think. and then checking each other, I guess.
Checking that you haven't gone down a rabbit hole on one particular player that,
exactly.
or you've seen something that you've almost convinced yourself that it's a value bet, but
yes.
the logic perhaps suggests otherwise. So, watching tennis, then obviously you must watch it extensively. Both of you watch it extensively. Is that watching live, watching video recordings, trying to if you like a particular bet, you're going to then just play it. For example, you're going to watch videos of how he performed against a matchup that might be similar to a game coming up. How does the video element come into it, and how do you critically analyze a tennis match in terms of betting on it?
Yeah, so I think this one is kind of quite mixed, because if I'm just in the mood to watch tennis, then I'll certainly watch it live. I'll watch it more or less critically. Like if I'm just wanting to enjoy it, I'm kind of absorbing what's going on. It's hard not to watch it critically at this point, but yeah, if I'm just in the mood to watch tennis, I'll just watch tennis and I'll watch whatever's on, and I'll usually just enjoy it regardless. But really, in terms of the work behind it, largely this will be, again, it's a combination of two things. Obviously, there's far too much tennis to watch everything, and it doesn't generally help you that much. Like if you understand how a player plays and you've watched them quite a few times, very much diminishing returns to doing that. But largely what I will be doing is I'll very much want to have watched them recently. Obviously, I'll want to have watched them several times recently, ideally in similar contexts, similar conditions. I'll want to feel like I understand how that player's playing. So if I'm watching them, I'll be trying to guess what they're going to do, basically. I don't always do it consciously, but I'm trying to figure out what style are they playing, why are they playing it. Most players are fairly one-dimensional is the wrong word. It sort of makes it sound rude, but most players have a very strong bias as to how they like to play.
Yeah.
And once you figure out what that is, and you've seen them interact with, a handful of different styles, then if you know what you're looking for, you know a player very well. And so what I will tend to do is I'll have a lot of matches recorded, so using something like Tennis TV, where I can then go back and I can watch the whole match. By just skipping through it, I can watch the whole match in maybe 10 minutes. And so what I'll be doing is, when I'm imagining the match, if I can't get enough clarity, if it's not clear enough, I'll be going back over these matches for both players, especially the matches that seem particularly relevant. So again, if I'm trying to imagine how do they play this shot on this court, in that context, I'll be going back over matches that are similar and thinking, okay, that's how they dealt with that shot. That's what they seem to like to do. Have they improved this shot recently? Again, all these kinds of questions. But it's usually there's something in my mind that I'm trying to figure out. And usually I'll be watching things that seem to direct me towards that. As I say, whether it's live or going back over recent matches and skipping through them to find the bits that seem really relevant.
Okay, yeah. So you can obviously watch games very quickly, make a decision on players based upon history against certain players. So it sounds like there's a database of tennis players there and online available to you. So you also mentioned that you've done some AI work. You've done a thesis on a profitable deep learning model. Talk me through that, because it sounds very on trend for 2023 with AI in the news at the moment.
Yes, that'd be a fun one, wouldn't it? Try and get ChatGPT to make money betting on tennis. So what I did was, it was part of my thesis for my master's, was I was essentially trying to use a neural network to find a profitable betting strategy. And there was a few reasons behind this. I was very surprised when I looked into this that there hasn't really been that much work done on it. I'm sure there's been non-public work done by hedge funds, etc. But most of the work that had been done on tennis betting seemed really crude to me. It was using things like players' ranks. It wasn't even incorporating the odds, things like this that didn't really make any sense to me as to why you would approach it like that. It was very academic, basically, as opposed to actually trying to solve this problem of how do we make money betting on tennis. And so there was a few things I wanted to try. And it sort of 6 months in of trying them, I was a bit distraught because I couldn't get it to work. And then eventually I sort of did manage to, and that was very rewarding. But basically the architecture of the model, I'm not going to go into too much detail because most people obviously don't know that much about deep learning, machine learning in general. And the sort of intricacies of the maths it's not that interesting. But the point really is that what the model's doing is there were around 200 different features, different factors that I looked at. And this is things like the ELO rating of the two players, things like the raw data. So I used OnCourt, which is a massive database that has all of the serve return stats, breakpoints, double faults, things like this, for about 1.5 million matches, I think. So I was using all these different raw bits of data. And what you then do with the model is you give it the odds that would have had for those matches. So you might take an example of a match between Djokovic and Federer. You generate a bunch of these features, which are based on, as I say, things like the ELO rating. And you then get the model to predict who's going to win based on those factors. You show it who actually won and the odds that they were. And you do this millions of times, and eventually it learns basically how to bet profitably in those contexts. And what I found, which was really cool, I was really happy with, is that especially on the games handicap market, so it's a slightly more normalized market than the actual match winner, it was able to make, I think it was about 8% return across a huge number of bets. Which, yeah, my thesis supervisor was very happy with. I was very happy with. I think all of the maths and that side of things, there were no mistakes there. So yeah, it was the first one that I found in the literature that's actually been able to make a good profit like that consistently. So it was very exciting.
Do you use it now to inform your bets? Yep.
So I use a variant of it. I've essentially improved it since then, and I've got it working on different markets. So rather than just using it for that market, I have it across several different ones. I think that the thing that was difficult with it was when you're training that kind of model, obviously the edge that it finds, especially with betting, is fairly temporal. So like it changes a lot. The way that it was betting in 2016 was very different to 2017, very different to 2018. Mm-hmm. So I think what I was trying to make sure of before I started using it myself was essentially how well that translates to this year, to sort of 2023. And I think it's hard to say in the sense that these things are always changing. You have to keep training them on the new data. Yeah. But it's continued to be profitable. It's continued to work. So happy days.
Yeah, excellent. Well, that sounds fascinating, and well done for building that and making one of the probably quite few tennis profitable AI models there. So you mentioned there about some of the markets you tackle. Let's talk about them, because obviously we mentioned Tennis Pilot's your service. And you do a lot of work on some of the side markets, as I would call them, like over under games or number of sets. Mm-hmm. No doubt your model is obviously identifying them as value. That's a conscious thing, is it? There's less focus on that from the bookmakers to find, and their prices are therefore they're sharp. Is that right? Why you target those markets?
So I think there's two things. The main thing comes back to what I said in the first place, which is that with anything where I'm trying to find value, really what I've found has been most effective for me has been understanding what I want to see and what I expect to see in those different contexts. So when you take something like a total games market, which is one that we use a lot, so you're betting on whether the match is going to be over or under a certain number of games, that kind of market, that kind of bet actually lends itself really well to the bookmakers because it's very easy to price that up, again, consistently. Most players fall within a fairly narrow band for that bet most of the time. But I think what I have found with that market is that actually that kind of dynamic reverses itself in a way, because what happens is you also have players who are very, very consistently good for certain types of play, certain types of matchups, certain types of matches. And I think generally speaking with, say, the total games market, with those matches, again, it's the same thing. I'm imagining the match. I'm trying to think about how it's going to play out. And normally the biggest factor for that particular market is when I'm trying to imagine the match, I really feel like one of the two players there'd have to be something kind of wrong with them for that to be the kind of matchup that's very one-sided. Again, it sounds quite sort of simplistic when you phrase it like that. But obviously, there's a lot of things going into that assessment. There's a lot of factors about how the match plays out. And a classic one would just be the style of the players. If you have, with total games bets, the classic thing is if you have two players, both of whom play better off the front foot, then that's usually going to be a good first step. Because obviously, you're not going to have a player where if they play really well, they're going to really push the other player off their game. It's just less common. So yeah, I think for that market, it's less that I think they pay less attention to it. I mean, the total games market is still a very big market, very liquid, especially for the big matches. It's more just that I think the way they price them is, as with the match odds markets and things, it's very generic. It's very based on this conception that all players are going to be the same. Sure. Even though I think with that market, that's generally true. Again, that's one thing that I found myself quite good at doing, is reading when it's not true, like reading which players are actually, and especially which matchups are particularly good for that.
Okay, I see. You do a lot of focus on the ATP, which is the top tier of men's tennis. I presume that's down to the fact that you know those players alongside the fact that there's good bookmaker liquidity, because you mentioned that in the previous answer there, there is good liquidity, even though some of those side markets, because there must be that challenge of if you're going to be taking ITF or Challenger Tour, low-level tennis matches, if you have X number of subscribers, they might struggle to get bets on. If they do get bets on, they'll get cut. How much of the market and the volume of bets that will be absorbed by bookmakers comes into your thinking when it comes to, having a bet advice for subscribers?
Yeah, it's definitely a big factor. I mean, I think it's not always easy to judge, because I think sometimes you can get events, if you have a week that's quite quiet, so if you have a week where there's no ATP events, you might actually get very good liquidity on the challenger markets because everybody wants to bet. So they'll find somewhere to bet. And the markets will adjust for that. But I think generally speaking, it's not just that you get better liquidity with the main markets. You often get more markets, so I have more choice. And they're often priced up. I don't know how you want to think about this. Like, to me, it feels like, and this might just be because I know the players better, but it also feels like in both cases, the markets, like side markets, like set overs and total games, are priced quite generically. But often it feels like you get very, very generic prices in the bigger tours. And I don't really know why that's the case, but I definitely see that sometimes. A really classic example of that's coming up now with Madrid. Madrid is a really fast event. It's at altitude. It's got one of the highest serve hold percentages. It's like, this is a very well-known thing in the tennis betting community. Like almost everyone that I follow will know this. And yet the bookmakers, I mean, I've tested this. If you look back over the last few years, if you were discerning at all with which players you chose, in other words, if you chose players who were generally quite serve reliant or matchups that are quite serve reliant, you would have made a lot of money just betting on tie breaks, betting on overs at this tournament. And I think that's a good example where I can't really explain exactly why, but it seems to me like bookmakers and the market in general consistently just underestimates certain trends, certain things, certain fundamental qualities of matches. In that case, just the speed of the court. So it really depends. But I think a lot of the time you end up in situations like that where you just notice something where you're like, oh, okay, for some reason in this particular event, and it is often main level events, they just have this tendency to completely misjudge this one factor over and over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's interesting, very interesting. And how do your bookmakers view tennis and tennis bettors in general, in your opinion, from your own experience and experience of your members?
Yeah, so I think very dependent on the bookmaker. I think in terms of, if we're talking about how they price it up, I think this is heavily algorithmic. This is heavily based on methods that they have tested over millions of matches, and they know that they will be very close to accurate over that scale of matches.
Yeah,
I've never worked at a bookmaker. It would be interesting to see. I'm sure that there are probably people who I could speak to who might know more about this, where actually understanding what factors they take into account could be very interesting for that. I assume that largely when they're pricing up, it's going to be the standard statistics based on, again, things like ELOs, like comparative rankings, and raw data and things like that. But if we're talking about how the bookmakers view bettors themselves...
Yes, that's more my concern there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's really, really dependent on the bookmaker. I mean, some bookmakers, if you take the sort of like marathon bets of the world, they often don't seem to take much money at all. And especially if you make money, they will block you out very quickly. Whereas if you take someone like Bet365, which is the one that I know I probably use the most, it's the one that my subscribers seem to be able to get the most money on with. I mean, I've been making money from Bet365 for years, and they've never really caused a fuss. I'm probably not making enough that it bothers them, to be honest, given how much money they make overall. But yeah, it's really dependent on the bookmaker. And I think you just learn that from doing it. Someone like Unibet, somewhere in the middle, that's the kind of bookmaker where you can definitely get a good bet on most of the time, but I've been limited with them for several years now. You can get a bit of both.
So it definitely does depend upon like the firm involved there. Like say Marathon Bet are very much the type of firm that will put up a big price on, whether it be football or tennis. And then just as soon as they see a shrewd player or someone who isn't clearly a mug, they're just going to cut them straight away. Whereas some firms like Bet365 will obviously give you a little bit more leeway and rope. How about exchanges? Are they an option, I guess, for the major tours, but are they doing some of the side markets that you're betting in, or is there much volume there?
So again, it depends on the match. Less so for the smaller tours like the Challenger Tour. But even then, you'll often get the total games market. That's a very common one. It's probably you sort of get match winner, handicap, total games. Normally, if you don't just get match winner, if you get something else as well, normally you'll get handicap and total games. So those are quite nice to have, and things like set betting as well.
And Asian firms, Pinnacle obviously offer a lot on tennis, don't they? Too?
Yes. Pinnacle's a frustrating one for me. I'd love to be able to bet with Pinnacle, but I can't in the UK, so that's sad.
You can't officially, I think.
I can't officially, that's true. But in terms of the exchanges, they're excellent. I think for the markets I choose, things like match odds and total games, they are often at least as good as, if not better than, the best bookmaker price. Not always. It does depend on the market, but oftentimes they will be a good price. Whereas if you take something like the outright market, which again is something that we've done quite well with, that one, you'll almost never find that on the exchange, sadly. So it does depend a bit on the market, but generally speaking, they're a great option, especially for someone who doesn't, for example, if you're limited with all the bookmakers or you want to bet a lot of money, that can be quite hard.
Yeah, well, that's part of the audience for SBC is there's a proportion of the audience who have been limited. And like you say, perhaps they can't use the likes of Pinnacle. So they're looking for different areas that they can bet into. They enjoy betting. And perhaps if they're listening to this, they might consider tennis, considering, there's good liquidity in some of the markets you're targeting. And let's touch on your service at Tennis Pilot, because you started that back in 2016. You've obviously been running that successfully. We've done a detailed review that's, by the time this comes out, will have been published. And you've got a really good record. I mean, nearly 7,000 bets, a 17% ROI. You must be pretty proud of that and the record that you have. Tell me a little bit about the type of person that comes and joins Tennis Pilot. And I presume you've got people who've been with you since day one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it kind of like hit a bit of a down with COVID, as I'm sure all tennis tipsters did, but have recovered nicely from that. And I think, to be honest, there's a huge range. I've had a range of people joining from, for example, Craig is a good example of somebody who very, very savvy bettor, follows different tipsters and understands these things himself. I don't think Craig would describe himself as a professional bettor or at least not a trader, but somewhere close to that. I had people who have explicitly described themselves as professional traders in tennis, and they wanted to know essentially how the service works and how they could use my bet. So I would have a conversation with them so that they understood what it means when I send a bet. Like, is it something they can use within their trading? And then right down to just the average person who likes tennis and just wants to have a bit of interest when they're watching the sport. It's obviously a fun thing to do. I think because of the way we price the service, we price in all of these people. That's what I was trying to do. This is not something where I'm trying to eke out every bit of money from the people following. It's something that I enjoy doing and that I know it offers value to people if they're happy to follow. So I think that whole range of people can benefit from it.
And do you get some people, in terms of how they find getting their bets on, but we just talked about a little bit, but is there an issue, in terms of increasing problems getting bets down or increasing limits and restrictions, maybe not just from following your service, just by the bookmaking industry in general and how it treats its customers in 2023?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think I haven't had that much complaints more recently, over the past, again, sort of since COVID, of people just not being able to get on full stop. I think certainly there is a problem with that. I think it's undeniable that as an industry, it is kind of unforgivably fickle in that way. If you're going to be trying to exploit people who don't understand betting at all, I feel like you kind of should have to deal with people who do actually understand how to bet. I don't know. I think it's a difficult one. But my sense from subscribers is that they have been able to get money on, perhaps not always at the best price. Like sometimes it can be the case where you have one firm that offers chunk better than other firms, and some subscribers just won't be able to get on that price. But generally speaking, I would hope that subscribers with the vast majority of the selections can get on near the best price at least, maybe with an exchange. But certainly if they've got, say, Bet365, a handful of other bookmakers and a couple of exchanges, they should have a good chance of getting on.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. And, I bet on tennis myself, and there are, pretty much all bookmakers offer at least ATP Tour, if perhaps not the lower level tours. And obviously there's volume on exchanges, and some of the Pinnacles and Circus Sports and Asian firms that will accept winners and are interested in volume will offer those markets. So there are lots of different options out there. So no, it's really interesting learning about you, your approach and Tennis Pilot. Like I said, we've done the review, SBC, you've got all the details there. It's a really impressive service that you run. I should also mention we've got a 25% discount for SBC members on all the free options. What does that bring the price down? It's per month, is it £19? And then it's reduced by 25% from there. Is that right?
Yeah, so $14.99 a month for the monthly recurring, which hopefully should appeal to people. Again, obviously, if you're betting any decent amount on the tennis, then you will make that back probably within a few bets. So yeah, I certainly feel like it should be a fair price for what people get.
Okay, yeah, I certainly think so. Yes, it's very well priced, and with that discount, even more so. So thank you ever so much for joining me, James. And do you want to fire out some links and how people can find out more, whether it be website, Twitter, or any other ways that they can get in touch?
Yeah, sure. So on Twitter, I am at Tennis Pilot. So that should be easy to find. And then the website is tennispilottips.com. So those are the two main areas where you can find us. And yeah, beyond that, you can see our spreadsheets. We have all of that stuff linked from Twitter yeah, I think that's the main places.
Yeah, but I should say the spreadsheet is really impressive, actually. You've got like nearly 7,000 worth of bets, but lots of different, you break it down like we do in SBC review in the different, context of categories or types of sport or filters. So that's really interesting to see. So there's lots there for people curious about, whether it's a service for themselves, whether they only want to bet on your outrights or certain markets. There's lots of things there to explore. So yeah, thank you ever so much, James. It's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a little bit more about the tennis betting world, and thank you for coming on. And I wish you all the best with Tennis Pilot moving forward.
Thank you so much, Pete. It was great being on.
Thank you.